to Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, Mr Foss strayed into areas that he shouldn't, of governments promising amazingly expensive promises. We passed the Emissions Trading Scheme bill last year, $110 billion to subsidise polluters to continue to pollute. We haven't promised in our wildest dreams anywhere near the amount of money misspent by this national government in that ill-conceived scheme. And Mr Foss talks about the records of government. I stand here proudly supporting the record of a Labor government that saw unemployment at its lowest level in 27 years. What is it that Mr Foss doesn't understand about 350,000 extra jobs created by the Labor government? What is it that Mr Foss doesn't understand about the fact that that Labor government saw upgradings to the highest level in 2 decades by the credit rating agencies? What is it that Mr Foss doesn't understand about the Labor government reducing our public debt in net terms to zero? That government should be very grateful for the economic management and fiscal responsibility of that last Labor government. But, Mr Speaker, I want to talk today about Mr Stephen Joyce and his mishandling and embarrassing flip-flop on the super gold card last week. Because, Mr Speaker, that was the clearest and most recent example yet of a government without a plan, without any guiding principles, and a government prepared to move away from the agenda that it put before the electorate in 2008. Mr Speaker, you'll remember that the National Party and opposition promised that the super gold card was sacrosanct, it wouldn't be touched. And then we saw last week a remarkable statement by Stephen Joyce, which says that the officials, he said, would consider how off-peak travel should be defined. That is, they were going to cut the hours in which the super gold card pensioners could travel. And he said that they were going to look at the eligibility of certain services like the Waiheke rail ferry and the Wellington to Wairarapa train. And I quote, Mr Speaker, "Some changes will need to be made because it is currently on track to exceed the available budget." End quote. That states in the clearest possible terms that Stephen Joyce was proposing to cut the super gold card. Yet, 24 hours later, and a phone call from behind a bush, and what do we find? What do we find from the Minister? He says, and I quote again, Mr Speaker, "We have made it clear all along that the government is totally committed to the super gold card, including the transport concession as it stands." That comment, that quote, was the absolute contradiction of what Stephen Joyce told the country 24 hours earlier. And that reminds me, Mr Speaker, of a saying by Groucho Marx that says, "These are my principles, and if you don't like them, I have others." I have others, Mr Speaker. That was remarkable. They promised not to touch the gold card. Mr Joyce put his neck on the block. He said that he was going to do it, and 24 hours later, he was running with his tail between his legs in exactly the opposite direction. And you know the remarkable thing about Stephen Joyce? He said it was a misunderstanding caused by my political opponents who were scaremongering. Mr Speaker, has the man no shame? Has he no pride? But, of course, he was following his leader because John Key, just a day or two ago, was accusing, likewise, the media of hysteria. He said the media was being hysterical because it was floating a proposal that 7,000 hectares of pristine environmental land on the Coromandel, on Great Barrier and Paparua National Park were going to be opened up for mining. The media was being hysterical. Well, there's one way he could have dealt with that hysteria, Mr. Speaker. He could have told the truth. Was that a proposal by the government or not? Was it a proposal or not? But he declined to answer that particular question, Mr. Speaker. The truth of the matter is that the process of government by this administration has been an absolute shambles. It's been dishonest and it's been decision-making without proper consideration before they make proposals and without transparency. And we've seen that also, Mr. Speaker, in the super city reforms, where this national government hides behind Rodney Hyde to do its dirty work, but won't take responsibility for policies condemned by the Chamber of Commerce in Auckland, condemned by the National Party candidate for the Auckland Mayoralty, John Banks, condemned by the New Zealand Herald, the Herald on Sunday, suburban newspapers, and almost every community group and individual that has commented on it. I say to the National Party, stop hiding behind Mr. Hyde, bring him to order and give democracy and transparency and accountability back to Auckland, Mr. Speaker. But if we're talking about dishonesty, surely the biggest dishonesty has been over the GST. Because I remember it, Mr. Speaker. I remember the words very well. And it said, it was something like this: the National Party will not be increasing GST. Now, that was John Key. But that was John Key before the election. After the election, suddenly we find that they are increasing GST. The national government has broken its word, it's broken its promise, and throughout the major cities of this country and around the major provincial towns and the small rural communities, I and my colleagues got very consistent feedback from every electorate represented by that National Party on the other side of the House. And what did they tell us? They told us we did not vote for GST. John Key promised that he would not increase GST. And my advice to John Key is take a leaf out of Stephen Joyce's book. Forget the pride, forget the shame, admit that you're wrong, admit that you're breaking your word, admit that you're going back on that sincere promise made to the electorate and dump the GST increase. Because the people of New Zealand told us in every community in this country that they were against it. They said it was just a tax switch. The government was going to give on one hand and take back on the other. But then they reflected and they said, now, didn't Bill English say that this process was going to be tax neutral? Now, if it's going to be tax neutral, explain this, that $1.5 billion is being proposed to go to the top 7% of income earners in New Zealand. If you don't earn over $70,000, forget anything about your situation being improved by these tax changes proposed in the budget. That's the truth of it. The only people that will benefit from these tax changes are the most wealthy. All of the members of this House included, all of the members. And ministers like Mr Williamson will get another $140 a week clear. $140 a week clear. John Key, now I'm not talking about his wider personal wealth, but about his Prime Ministerial salary, it's worth $310 a week. Paul Reynolds, on the Chief Executive of Telecom, on his basic salary, not his bonus, because I don't actually think he'll get a bonus this year, on his basic salary will get another $1,300 a week. But, Mr Speaker, the ordinary citizens in my electorate, the middle-income folk and the low-income folk, the best that the national government can promise them is that they'll be no worse off. Well, Mr Speaker, the truth is they don't even believe that miserable promise. They don't believe that. And the issue I want to finish on, Mr Speaker, 1 year out from the Job Summit, is employment. You know, there were three big ideas in that Job Summit. The Job Summit that John Key told us would not be a talk fest, but was. The big ideas, a $2 billion bank loan, fell over before it got off the ground.